Canada is no exception to rising temperatures. So, what's behind this extreme heat and how can we adapt? Here with some answers is Blair Feltmate. He's the head of the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo. Thanks for joining us, Blair.
Thank you for having me.
What is causing these record-breaking temperatures?
Well, effectively what we're seeing is climate change in action. As suggested through the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for quite a while now, they've been warning us about increasing temperatures driven through the burning of fossil fuels. And now we're really starting to see what those increasing temperatures look like in very tangible form all around the planet.
We've heard a lot of experts say things are expected to get worse. How much worse?
They're going to get considerably worse, or more challenging extreme heat. As a general rule of thumb, for cities across Canada, from Victoria to Halifax, between now and 2050 to 2080, and gradually creeping up, the maximum daily temperatures realized in the major cities across the country, they're going to increase by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius beyond that which you're seeing now. So, for example, I happen to be sitting in Toronto. The maximum temperature we realize in the summer in Toronto right now is about 35, 36 degrees Celsius. That's going to go up to 40 to 41 degrees Celsius. And then for the number of hot days per summer as a measure by over 30 degrees Celsius, for the average Canadian city, the number of hot days per summer is going to double, triple, or in cases of cities like Windsor, for example, the number of hot days per summer is going to quadruple the number of days over 30 degrees Celsius. So the heat is coming big time.
So I think it's an important question to ask. Who is most at risk here when we think about how the future might be looking?
There's three groups primarily at risk. The top group, most at risk, it's the elderly, meaning people greater than 70 years of age, living alone, of limited financial means, which probably means they don't have air conditioning. This is the group that's most at risk, and it's the group for which we should be mapping out in major cities across Canada. Where are these people living in buildings? And we need people to be checking on them during heat waves to make sure, are they hydrated? Do they have a fan? Do they have an air conditioner? Do they need a lift, a ride to a cooling center? That's the first group. The second group are the homeless. And within cities, we need people checking up. We need roving teams during heat waves in cities to check on the homeless to make sure they're hydrated. Do they know where the cooling centers are? Do they need a trip there? Then the third group are people with pre-existing health conditions that are usually some combination of respiratory and cardiac in nature. And for that group and the previous two groups, what we are establishing in Canada right now are heat alert response systems whereby ahead of the heat wave coming, we have the equivalent of an amber alert goes out to warn people the extreme heat is coming. And for those of you who are particularly vulnerable, put yourself in a location where you're not going to be in harm's way during the heat wave.
Blair, I think when a lot of people hear this, and I know this is very common, that when we talk about stories like this, it's get very alarming, very upsetting. And I think many people then ask, well, what can be done? What can we do about this?
There's quite a bit that we can do. In other words, we don't have to be victims of circumstance. For example, in cities, anybody who's flown into a large city, whether Toronto, Montreal, Calgary, Vancouver, wherever, when you look down at cities tend to be hotter than the surrounding countryside by about 3 to 5 degrees Celsius due to something called the heat island effect. Almost universally, roofs are black. And when sunlight hits that dark surface, that dark black surface of tar, only about 20% of that energy radiates back up into space. The rest of the heat stays in the system and contributing to heating. But if we were to paint those roofs white, called cool roofs, when sunlight hits the bright surface of a white roof, about 80% of the energy reflects back into space and only 20% stays in the system. So relative to a dark roof, a white roof is the way to go. We want to make sure within cities that we have more shade areas, trees where people can go and sit underneath trees and get out of the direct sunlight. And then within homes themselves, whether it's an apartment or a house, we can have mechanical shutters on windows to keep the sunlight out from entering into the house. And then finally, what we also need to think about is access to air conditioning or cooling, if you will, as a fundamental human right. Because even if you do these passive things that I've just mentioned, which are all good things to do, that buys you a couple of days of time when a heat wave hits. But if you're at 38 degrees Celsius over an extended period of time, despite doing all the passive cooling, the heat will infiltrate into a building. Therefore, we need, I believe, access to air conditioning. We need to think about this as a fundamental human right. And so these are all things that can be done and can be done very cost effectively.
Blair, thank you so much for this. I know we could talk about this forever. Blair Feltmate is the head of the Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo.